For 300 cycles, the Vakran Dominion had carved their empire across the stars with impunity. Their warships, massive constructs of dark metal and pulsing energy, moved through contested space like predators through shallow water. Colony after colony fell before them. Independent worlds that had known peace for generations watched their skies darken with Vakran dreadnoughts, and within hours, their resistance crumbled into ash and memory. The Dominion's military doctrine was brutally simple: overwhelming force applied without hesitation, without mercy, without the possibility of negotiation. They didn't conquer territories, they erased the very concept of opposition. The galaxy had learned to fear the sight of Vakran battle formations dropping from hyperspace. Their capital ships bristled with weapons that could crack planets, their shields absorbed firepower that would vaporize lesser vessels, and their commanders operated with a cold certainty that bordered on contempt. When the Kelvin Federation mounted their legendary defense at the Red Light Nebula, bringing together the combined fleets of 17 worlds, the Vakran shattered them in less than 6 hours. When the silicon-based architects of Threshold Prime deployed their reality-bending weapons, technology that bent the laws of physics themselves, the Vakran adapted within days and reduced their crystalline cities to dust. Every species that stood against them learned the same bitter lesson: resistance was merely a prelude to extinction. The psychological impact of Vakran dominance rippled through civilized space like a wound that wouldn't heal. Trade routes shifted to avoid their expanding borders. Diplomatic channels fell silent. Ancient alliances fractured as worlds calculated whether survival meant submission or annihilation. In the grand assemblies where species once debated philosophy and shared discoveries, conversations turned to darker mathematics: how long until the Dominion reached their sector, how many years they had left, whether fleeing into uncharted space offered any hope at all. The Vakran had become more than conquerors, they had become inevitability itself, a force as unstoppable as entropy, as certain as the heat death of stars. In the Tertian cluster, where 5 inhabited systems orbited a shared gravitational center, the end arrived on a morning that had dawned like any other. The Vakran fleet materialized at the edge of the system, 37 capital ships arranged in their characteristic talon formation. They broadcast no warnings, issued no demands. They simply began their approach, weapons charging, shields flaring with that distinctive violet light that had become the harbinger of civilization's final moments. The Tertian Defense Force, comprising the combined military assets of all 5 worlds, moved to intercept. They were outgunned, outmatched, and they knew it, but the Tertians possessed something the galaxy had nearly forgotten: the stubborn conviction that some things were worth dying for, even when victory was impossible. The defense coordinator, a veteran named Kellis whose scales had grayed through 4 decades of service, transmitted a message to every ship in the fleet. Her voice carried no false hope, no grand speeches about triumph against odds. She simply said that their children were watching, that their names would be remembered, and that if this was humanity's last stand, they would make it count. The Tertian ships accelerated toward the Vakran formation, and for 3 hours, they fought with a ferocity that gave even the Dominion pause. Tertian destroyers executed suicide runs against Vakran dreadnoughts, their crews singing ancestral songs as they detonated their reactors against enemy shields. Fighter craft wove through defensive fire that turned space itself into a lethal lattice of energy. They fought like cornered animals, like parents defending their young, and in those 3 hours, they managed to destroy 2 Vakran cruisers and damage a dozen more. But 3 hours was all they had. When the Tertian Defense Force finally broke, when the last of their ships tumbled through the void trailing atmosphere and fire, the Vakran barely paused. Their fleet reformed and continued toward the inhabited worlds, preparing to deliver the bombardment that would transform living planets into lifeless monuments to Dominion power. In command bunkers on 5 worlds, military leaders watched their scopes and prepared for the end. Civilians in the great cities looked up at skies that would soon burn. Parents held their children close. And across the Tertian cluster, billions of beings faced the final minutes of their existence with whatever dignity they could muster, knowing that their courage, their resistance, their very lives would be forgotten in the vast sweep of galactic history, just another footnote in the Vakran's inexorable expansion. Then something changed. On every sensor, on every tactical display in the cluster, a new signature appeared. It materialized in high orbit above the fourth planet, a single contact where none had existed a moment before. Ships didn't simply appear like that, hyperspace transitions left traces, wormhole exits created gravitational ripples, even the most advanced stealth systems produced some detectable signature. But this vessel had simply arrived, as if it had been there all along and had only just decided to be noticed. The Terran sensor operators stared at their displays, trying to make sense of readings that seemed to contradict themselves. The Vakran fleet detected it simultaneously, and for the first time in recorded military history, a Dominion formation hesitated. Not from fear, the Vakran didn't fear, but from a calculation that suddenly included an unknown variable. Their tactical protocols had no precedent for this situation, no classification for a vessel that appeared without transition, no threat assessment for a signature that registered simultaneously as massive and compact, ancient and impossibly advanced. The Vakran fleet commander, a being whose neural architecture had been optimized for warfare through 6 generations of genetic engineering, initiated standard threat response, query the unknown vessel, analyze its capabilities, determine optimal engagement parameters. The communications array transmitted in 17 languages, demanding identification, intent, and immediate compliance with Dominion authority. The response came not in words but in motion. The vessel accelerated, and every physicist monitoring the encounter felt their understanding of physics shudder. Objects that massive didn't move like that. Inertia was supposed to resist, relativistic effects should have applied, but this ship moved as if Newton's laws were optional suggestions rather than fundamental constants. It positioned itself between the Vakran fleet and the innermost inhabited world, a gesture so clear in its meaning that no translation was necessary. This was a statement of protection, a line drawn in the vacuum, a challenge issued not through weapons or threats but through simple, absolute positioning. The vessel itself defied easy description. Its hull seemed to shift in appearance depending on the angle of observation, sometimes appearing as burnished metal, sometimes as something darker that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It bore no obvious weapons emplacements, no visible shield generators, none of the external architecture that characterized military vessels. Yet it radiated power in a way that every sensor operator could feel in their bones, that made the hair stand up on carbon-based life forms and sent warning signals cascading through silicon mines. The ship measured approximately 2 kilometers in length, modest by capital ship standards, but its presence filled space with an authority that size alone couldn't explain. Along its hull, barely visible, were markings in a script that database searches couldn't identify, and a designation that would soon echo across the galaxy, TCS Indomitable. The Vakran commander made his decision with the cold logic that had won 1,000 battles. Unknown vessels were simply vessels without sufficient data, and sufficient data came from combat. He initiated attack pattern Sigma 7, a formation designed to overwhelm superior single targets through coordinated fire from multiple vectors. 37 Vakran warships adjusted their positions, weapon systems achieving target lock, shield generators cycling to maximum output. The firing solution was perfect, the execution flawless. When the Vakran opened fire, the combined output of their weapons arrays was sufficient to sterilize a continent, enough destructive force to reduce any known capital ship to its constituent atoms within seconds. The Terran Battleship's shields materialized as a sphere of translucent energy that seemed to warp space itself around the vessel. The Vakran barrage struck with the force of a collapsing star, and the shields didn't just absorb the impact, they appeared to redistribute it, to redirect it, to render it fundamentally irrelevant. Energy that should have melted armor and boiled away superstructure dissipated like morning mist against a mountain. The Vakran fired again, sustaining a bombardment that would have exhausted a lesser fleet's entire energy reserves. For 90 seconds, they poured destruction into that sphere of defensive energy, and the Terran battleship sat immobile within its protection, apparently untroubled, almost patient. When the Vakran barrage finally ceased, more from confusion than from tactical choice, the Indomitable responded. What happened next was later analyzed by every military academy in civilized space, studied frame by frame, debated by theorists and strategists, and ultimately concluded to be both impossible and undeniable. The battleship didn't fire a weapons array because it didn't have weapons arrays in any conventional sense. Instead, the vessel itself became the weapon. Points along its hull began to glow with a blue-white light that spectral analysis couldn't properly classify, and from those points, beams of coherent energy lanced out toward the Vakran formation. These weren't plasma bolts or particle beams or any known energy weapon. They moved too fast, struck too precisely, and their effects defied standard physics. When they struck Vakran shields, those shields simply ceased. Not overwhelmed, not penetrated, but negated, as if they had never existed. The beams continued through armor that had withstood planet-killer weapons, through bulkheads designed to resist nuclear fire, through the very structure of ships that had been deemed invulnerable. But they didn't explode, didn't burn, didn't vaporize. They cut. With surgical precision, those beams severed weapon systems, disabled propulsion, carved through critical systems while leaving life support and crew quarters intact. Within 30 seconds, 6 Vakran dreadnoughts were rendered combat ineffective, drifting in space, their crews alive but their warships reduced to expensive lifeboats. The psychological impact on the Vakran was profound and immediate. For 300 cycles, they had been the force that could not be stopped. They had faced desperate courage, advanced technology, numerical superiority, tactical brilliance, and they had overcome all of it through sheer, overwhelming might. But this was different. This wasn't a valiant last stand that they would eventually crush, this was superiority meeting something more superior. The Vakran fleet commander did what no Dominion officer had done in living memory, he ordered a tactical withdrawal. Not a retreat, Vakran doctrine didn't acknowledge the existence of retreats, but a repositioning to acquire better data on this unknown threat. His fleet pulled back to extreme weapons range, damaged vessels moving to the rear, remaining ships forming defensive clusters. In command centers across the Tertian worlds, operators watched in stunned silence as the unstoppable force that had come to end their civilization fled from a single ship. Children who moments before had been preparing for death now pressed against windows to watch the impossible unfold in their skies. The Terran Battleship didn't pursue. It maintained its position between the Vakran fleet and the inhabited worlds, a guardian that had appeared from nowhere and now stood unmovable. For long minutes, nothing happened. The Vakran regrouped. The Tertians held their breath. And the Indomitable simply waited, its presence in the system both a promise and a warning. Then the communications arrays of every ship, every station, every receiver in the cluster activated simultaneously. The message was broadcast in perfect Vakran, in flawless Tertian, in the native languages of 17 other species known to operate in this sector, and in 3 languages that database searches couldn't identify but that somehow felt old, ancient, weighted with history. The voice was human. After centuries of galactic conflict, after the Vakran had catalogued thousands of species and conquered hundreds of worlds, the voice was unmistakably, undeniably human. It was calm, measured, carrying authority without arrogance, strength without cruelty. It said simply, "This star system is under Terran protection. You will withdraw immediately. You will not return. Any further aggression will be met with proportionate response. This is your only warning." The word Terran rippled through intelligence networks across civilized space within minutes. Species that had thought themselves alone in their resistance to the Vakran suddenly had questions. Databases were searched, ancient records examined, and fragmentary stories began to coalesce. Terra. Earth. The homeworld of humanity, a species that had been spacefaring for less time than most civilizations had recorded history, a species that had been considered minor players on the galactic stage, resource-rich but technologically average, diplomatically active but militarily insignificant. The humans had colonies, certainly, trade routes, diplomatic missions, but their warships had never featured in major conflicts, their military doctrine had never warranted serious study. They were the friendly species, the adaptable ones, the curious explorers who seemed more interested in art and philosophy than conquest. But that assessment had been based on what humanity allowed others to see. The Indomitable represented something else entirely, something that had been kept carefully hidden behind a facade of average capabilities. This wasn't a prototype, wasn't an experimental vessel, wasn't some desperate last gambit thrown together from stolen technology. The precision of its systems, the smoothness of its operation, the calm confidence of its commander. These spoke of mature technology, tested doctrine, a military machine that had been operating in the shadows while the galaxy watched its public face. The Vakran commander faced a choice that no amount of genetic optimization had prepared him for. He could attack, could bring the full might of his fleet against this single vessel, could test whether Dominion numbers could overwhelm Terran technology. The tactical computers calculated probabilities, analyzed the engagement patterns, and returned results that made no sense. Based on observed capabilities, the Terran vessel had a 97% probability of neutralizing the entire Vakran fleet while sustaining minimal damage. Not defeating, neutralizing. The distinction was important. This ship wasn't just powerful, it was designed for precise application of overwhelming force, for surgical dismantling of enemy capabilities. For the first time in Vakran military history, a fleet commander chose discretion over valor. He ordered full retreat, hyperspace calculations initiated immediately, jump coordinates set for the nearest Dominion stronghold. The decision would be analyzed, questioned, potentially result in his removal from command, but the alternative was watching 37 capital ships reduced to scrap by a single enemy vessel. As the Vakran fleet began their hyperspace transition, their sensors detected something that made the commander's genetic enhancements trigger a cascade of stress responses. The Terran Battleship had never been alone. Now that the immediate threat was withdrawing, the Indomitable systems powered down to standby, and in doing so, revealed what its active signatures had been masking. Throughout the Tertian cluster, in high orbits, in asteroid fields, positioned at Lagrange points and tucked into the shadows of gas giants, other signatures began to appear. Not dozens. Hundreds. Terran vessels of varying sizes, from destroyers to dreadnoughts, from carriers to ships whose configuration suggested purposes the Vakran couldn't immediately identify. They hadn't jumped in. They hadn't been hiding behind stealth technology. They had been there all along, waiting, watching, prepared to intervene if the Indomitable's presence alone wasn't sufficient. The Tertian cluster hadn't been protected by a single ship making a desperate stand, it had been deliberately fortified by a military force that operated on a scale and with a sophistication the galaxy hadn't suspected humans possessed. The Vakran fleet jumped to hyperspace, their retreat carrying news that would reshape galactic politics. The Tertians, who had faced extinction with courage and had been granted survival by intervention, found themselves trying to process what had happened. Their sensors showed Terran vessels in positions of strategic importance throughout the cluster, but these ships made no demands, issued no statements of conquest, didn't behave like occupiers or saviors expecting gratitude. They simply remained, silent guardians whose presence answered some questions while raising countless more. On the command deck of the Indomitable, Captain Sarah Chen stood before the main viewport, watching the last traces of Vakran hyperspace signatures fade from her tactical display. Her expression remained neutral, professional, but her eyes held something deeper, not satisfaction, not triumph, but the quiet acknowledgement of a threshold crossed. For 70 years, since the Vakran Dominion had first expanded beyond their home sector, Terran intelligence had been watching, analyzing, preparing. Humanity had seen empires rise and fall throughout history, had studied the patterns of tyranny, understood the mathematics of oppression. When the Vakran emerged as a threat to galactic stability, the Terran government had made a decision, not to intervene immediately, but to observe, to learn, to prepare for the moment when intervention would be both necessary and effective. That decision had cost lives. Worlds had fallen while Terran ships remained hidden, while human diplomats expressed concern through official channels but took no military action. The moral weight of that choice rested heavily on everyone who had carried the secret, from the highest levels of Terran government to captains like Chen who commanded vessels capable of stopping atrocities but were ordered to wait, to watch, to maintain the fiction of humanity's military insignificance. The waiting had been strategic, calculated to achieve maximum impact when humanity finally revealed its hand, but strategy didn't ease the burden of knowing that people died while you possessed the means to save them. Chen's tactical officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb, broke the silence. "Captain, we're receiving communication requests from Tertian ground control, from their orbital platforms, from approximately 200 civilian and military frequencies. They want to know who we are, where we came from, why we intervened." His voice carried the weight of a question he didn't need to ask. What do we tell them? The answer had been decided by people far above Chen's pay grade, drafted in diplomatic offices and military strategy sessions, but the delivery fell to her. She opened a channel to all Tertian frequencies, knowing her words would be recorded, analyzed, transmitted across the galaxy within hours. "This is Captain Sarah Chen of the Terran colonial ship Indomitable, representing the Terran Defense Initiative. Humanity has been monitoring the Vakran Dominion's expansion for 7 decades. We have watched your courage today, witnessed your willingness to stand against impossible odds to protect your homes and your children. You fought with honor, and you deserve to know that your sacrifice was not in vain. The Vakran will not return to this system. The Terran government is prepared to extend formal protection to any worlds threatened by Dominion aggression. We will not conquer, will not occupy, will not demand tribute or submission. We offer only what was offered to you today, a chance to survive, to rebuild, to determine your own destiny free from the threat of annihilation." The response from the Tertian worlds was immediate and overwhelming. Offers of gratitude, requests for alliance, questions about humanity's capabilities, demands for historical explanation of where these ships had come from. Chen let her communications officer handle the flood of inquiries while she focused on the larger implications of what had just occurred. The Vakran wouldn't simply accept this defeat. They would regroup, analyze, adapt. They would test humanity's resolve, probe for weaknesses, perhaps launch a major offensive to determine whether the Terran Defense Initiative was truly capable of backing up its claims or whether the Indomitable represented humanity's entire advanced military capacity. Let them come, Chen thought. Let them discover what 70 years of preparation looks like. Humanity had spent those decades not in passive observation but in active development. While maintaining the appearance of a modest military presence, Terran shipyards had been working at full capacity, building vessels that incorporated technology decades ahead of galactic standards. Terran scientists had made breakthroughs in energy generation, weapon systems, defensive shields, and propulsion that would have revolutionized the galaxy if shared openly. Instead, those breakthroughs had been classified, weaponized, integrated into a military doctrine designed for one purpose: to defeat an enemy that considered itself invincible. The cost of this secrecy had been more than just the lives lost while humanity prepared. It had been the trust of galactic neighbors, the reputation of a species that had seemed content to watch atrocities unfold while doing nothing. When the full scope of Terran military capabilities became known, other species would have questions, accusations, anger at humanity's choice to intervene now rather than years ago. Chen understood that anger, shared it even, but she also understood the strategic necessity. If humanity had revealed its hand too early, before building sufficient force to guarantee victory, the result would have been catastrophic. The Vakran would have adapted, focused their full might on eliminating the Terran threat, and the galaxy would have witnessed not salvation but the destruction of humanity's capacity to help anyone. Across the Tertian cluster, Terran vessels began coordinating with local authorities, establishing patrol routes, setting up communication protocols, offering humanitarian assistance to damaged stations and ships. These were tasks the crews had trained for, scenarios they had run in simulation countless times. The Terran Defense Initiative wasn't improvising. This was the execution of a plan years in the making, a plan that accounted for political fallout, diplomatic complications, and the inevitable questions about humanity's true intentions. On a dozen worlds, in intelligence offices and military command centers, analysts were already compiling reports on what had occurred in the Tertian cluster. The data would be incomplete, filtered through limited sensor readings and second-hand accounts, but certain facts would be undeniable. Humanity possessed advanced military technology. Humanity had deployed a significant fleet while maintaining complete operational security. Humanity had intervened against the Vakran and won decisively. Those facts would change galactic politics overnight, would shift alliances, would force every species to recalculate their strategic position in a galaxy where humans were no longer minor players but potential kingmakers. In the weeks following what became known as the Battle of Tertian Cluster, the galaxy learned to reassess humanity. Diplomatic missions from dozens of worlds arrived at Terran stations, seeking information, offering alliances, requesting protection. The Terran government responded with careful transparency, releasing some information about the defense initiative while maintaining operational security around classified systems. Yes, humanity had been building a military force. Yes, we had been monitoring Vakran expansion. Yes, we intervened when we determined the time was right. No, we will not conquer. No, we will not dominate. We offer protection to those who request it, alliance to those who seek it, and opposition only to those who choose tyranny. The Vakran Dominion's response was predictable. They launched probing attacks against Terran-protected worlds, testing the limits of humanity's commitment and capabilities. Each attack was repelled with the same surgical precision demonstrated by the indomitable Terran vessels, disabling Vakran ships without destroying them, minimizing casualties even among enemy forces. This restraint was itself a message: we are powerful enough to destroy you, but we choose not to. We fight to protect, not to annihilate. The psychological impact on Vakran forces was significant. Soldiers who had been conditioned to view combat as total war, where defeat meant death and victory meant extermination of the enemy, found themselves disabled, captured, and then released with their personal effects and a simple message: go home, tell your leaders that continued aggression will be met with continued resistance. Within 6 months, the Vakran launched what they intended as a decisive strike, a fleet of 300 capital ships, the largest offensive force they had ever assembled, targeting a Terran colony world in the frontier sectors. Intelligence suggested this world was lightly defended, that if the Vakran could crush a Terran colony, they could demonstrate that humanity's protection was hollow, that the defense initiative couldn't be everywhere at once. The attack was carefully planned, perfectly executed, and it encountered a Terran defensive fleet that had been waiting in position for 2 weeks, having intercepted Vakran communications and predicted their target with uncanny accuracy. The battle lasted 4 hours and resulted in the capture of 127 Vakran vessels and the complete destruction of only 3 ships whose reactors were destabilized by damage and detonated before crews could be evacuated. Terran forces sustained minimal casualties and no ship losses. The captured Vakran crews were treated according to standard protocols for prisoners of war, given medical care, adequate shelter, and were repatriated to Dominion space within a month. The captured vessels themselves were studied, their technology analyzed, and then returned to Vakran space via automated navigation, stripped of weapons but otherwise intact. The message was clear. We don't need your technology, we don't want your territory, we simply will not allow you to continue unopposed. The political structure of the Vakran Dominion began to fracture. Military commanders who had built careers on inevitable victory found themselves relieved of command after losing to Terran forces. Dominion worlds that had been contributing resources to endless expansion began questioning whether continued conflict served their interests. Factions emerged advocating for diplomatic engagement with humanity, for treaties and boundaries rather than perpetual war. The transformation wasn't immediate and wasn't bloodless. Political upheaval within the Dominion led to internal conflicts as different factions struggled for control, but the trajectory was undeniable. The empire built on martial supremacy was crumbling because someone had proven that supremacy was an illusion. For Captain Chen and the crew of the Indomitable, the months following the Tertian intervention became a pattern of deployment, engagement, and protection. They escorted refugee convoys, established defensive perimeters around vulnerable worlds, and stood as silent guardians in systems that had known only fear. The work was unglamorous, often tedious, occasionally terrifying when Vakran forces tested their resolve, but it was work that mattered. Every world they protected was a civilization that survived, children who grew up, cultures that continued. The moral calculus of those 70 years of preparation still haunted Chen, the lives that might have been saved if humanity had acted sooner, but she could see the results of acting when and how they did. They hadn't just defeated the Vakran, they had changed the fundamental power dynamics of galactic civilization. On the first anniversary of the Battle of Tertian Cluster, a memorial was erected on the largest of the Tertian worlds. It honored the defense forces who had fought knowing they would die, who had bought time for evacuation ships, who had stood against hopelessness with courage. But it also included a section dedicated to the Terran Defense Initiative, acknowledging the intervention that had saved billions of lives. At the dedication ceremony, Captain Chen stood beside Kellis, the Tertian defense coordinator who had led her people's final stand. The two officers, from different worlds and different species, shared a moment of understanding that needed no words. They had both done what duty required, had both carried the weight of impossible decisions, had both witnessed what courage looked like when everything was at stake. The galaxy after the Tertian intervention was fundamentally different from the galaxy before it. The Vakran Dominion's expansion had been halted, their reputation for invincibility shattered. Other aggressive empires reconsidered their strategies, understanding that the galactic balance of power had shifted. Humanity emerged not as conquerors but as a stabilizing force, powerful enough to enforce peace but restrained enough to be trusted. The Terran Defense Initiative became a model for collective security, with other species contributing ships and resources to create a multi-species force dedicated to preventing large-scale aggression. But the cost of that peace was measured in the lives lost during humanity's 70 years of preparation, in the worlds that fell while Terran ships watched and waited. Captain Chen never forgot that cost, carried it with her through every subsequent deployment, let it inform every decision about when and how to use the power at her command. Power without restraint was tyranny. Power without purpose was chaos. But power used carefully, applied precisely, in defense of those who couldn't defend themselves, that was the promise humanity had made when the Indomitable entered Tertian space and changed everything. In the end, the story of that intervention became more than military history, it became a statement about what was possible when those with strength chose to use it not for conquest but for protection, not for domination but for defense. The galaxy learned that day that no force is truly unstoppable, that tyranny always eventually meets resistance, and that sometimes, resistance arrives in the form of a single battleship dropping from nowhere, standing between oppression and freedom, and simply refusing to move. The Vakran had thought themselves invincible until a Terran battleship entered the battlefield. The galaxy had thought humanity insignificant until we proved otherwise. And the Tertians, who had prepared to die with dignity, learned instead to live with hope, protected by guardians who had come from Earth, carrying with them the oldest and most powerful of human convictions, that some things are worth fighting for, that courage matters, and that the strong have a duty to defend those who cannot defend themselves.